One thing is essential. To accelerate decisions, you need innovation that fits the mission. We innovate from AI to zero trust. We integrate using open APIs that you control. We automate with smart solutions so warfighters know and act faster. Your mission, accelerated. Tomorrow's challenges, anticipated. Win faster with Booz Allen.
Hi, and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. This is part 2 of my conversation with Rachel Hoff and Dale Swartz, who worked on the Reagan Institute's National Security Innovation-Based Report Card. So, Rachel, Dale, we've been talking about your report card and some of the grades that you gave to the defense ecosystem, good and bad. Before we dive into more of those grades, I want to ask about how you built the report card. We talked about some of the great people who worked on it, but tell us a little bit more about the methodology. I know there was a great use of data, for example. Talk us through how you built the grades.
Sure, I'm happy to. I'll get started with that one. So we had a fairly structured process as we thought about this overall, we started with, again, sort of identifying the set of indicators that we thought were most diagnostic for assessing the health of the NSIB. That ended up being a great discussion and a challenge in our first year. And one of the things that we really tried to do in version 2, and we're working on version 3 right now, is to validate that, hey, are these the 10 that really matter at the end of the day? So far, we've got pretty good confidence they do. Everybody pokes at it a little bit as, hey, did you think about X? Did you think about Y? As you talked about a little bit in the last episode, some of these indicators are fairly interrelated. And so actually trying to tease out some of the nuance, of course, is a challenge, but we're trying to make sure we're laying a glove here sort of across the board. So that's piece one. The only thing I think that we did that's a change this time around in terms of the indicators themselves is we actually, for those who follow these things very closely, we actually swapped the order a little bit. And this is actually a really important thing that we did. We focused and we actually put the output indicators as first this time around. I know we're going to talk about customer clarity probably in a minute, but customer clarity in the first iteration was number 1. A lot of discussion got stuck on customer clarity because it is a very important, very controversial indicator. But we said, look, this is obviously a place that we need to spend time because as you think about budgets, commander's intent, otherwise it's going to flow through. But ultimately, we are solving for outcomes. And so we are doing this all in the spirit of defense modernization. So let's have that be the first one. From there, we basically put together a set of underlying assessment questions and metrics that sort of inform each of these. We're talking about the 10 headline grades, but for those who dig really, really into the report card, and I know that you did, there's actually a couple of core driving assessment questions and subset grades within each of these because there's nuance. There's some areas that actually do pretty well, others that don't do quite as well. And part of the point here is innovation is such a hairy topic. It means so many different things to different people. It's charged actually politically, emotionally, and otherwise around what it means that we're trying to actually pinpoint the areas that are root causes of some of the issues that we're talking about, but while also celebrating the strengths. And you can only do that while to some extent you have a measurable but somewhat sort of granular way to determine this. And then we basically went off and did a bunch of quantitative analysis, interviews, and otherwise with folks sort of across the board. So, as I think we've talked about previously, in the aggregate, several hundred different interviews with different stakeholders across multiple departments in the U.S. government, significant number of folks on the congressional side at the committee level and in member offices and otherwise, lots of industry interviews, both with legacy traditional defense primes and with startups and disruptors. I live in Silicon Valley, so we spend a lot of time with sort of the community out that way, allies and partners and otherwise. And then we layer onto that, the significant amount of budgetary data, human capital data, investment flows and otherwise to kind of put the picture together with the intent of, one, this is something that should be a repeatable process. So we're not trying to make this a black box. Two, make sure that there is actually sufficient showing our work and actually, data points for people to use to support some of the policy priorities that are, that are happening here across the board, and ultimately give this, something that has a fair bit of rigor at the end of the day.
Yeah, we're off topic a little bit here, but I love the idea that you're using real data sources, publicly available data sources, both things traditionally looked at by the government, budgets, appropriations, those kinds of things, as well as investment capital flows, mergers and acquisitions, those kinds of things, which are traditionally not looked at by the government other than for regulatory purposes, but are traditionally looked at by the private capital side. And putting those together gives us a better sense of what today's innovation base actually is. It's a combination of those two things. The other thing I love is if you actually are doing this more quantitatively, you're creeping towards giving us the ability to model clever policy ideas and their impacts on what you guys are doing nicely, separating inputs from outputs as best you possibly can. And I'd love to be talking to you in a couple of years to say, yeah, the guys on the Hill were trying this clever new policy out, and we helped them by showing them what we think the data would look like if they did this. And that helped this indicator. That would be a wonderful world to live in someday.
Well, we're actually moving a little bit in that direction. Rachel can probably talk about a couple examples, but you're absolutely right. The way I think about this is, those online kind of credit score model things you do. You got like a 650, and what if I paid down this credit card, or what if I open this one, or I cancel this one, or kind of change my kind of percentage of credit utilized? What does that actually do in my score? Certainly, we're probably not at the level of being able to have that level of tick and tie and sophistication, but that certainly is part of, in the aggregate, the policy process where we want to push people to.
Yeah, and I think there's an element. When we started the report card, even in its first year, 2023, we wanted to kind of see, look, there had already been a lot of activity across the suite of national security innovation issues, and year on year now, we want to be able to look at what is moving the needle toward progress when we think about all of those various policy interventions and reforms that are happening along the way. So love the idea. I think it's a really important observation, Arun, to move kind of more in that modeling direction. And if our product can be useful in that way, then we're eager to do so.
I love the new additions to the structure of the report card. Talk a little bit about one of them in particular, headwinds and tailwinds. How did you decide to think about that? What is a headwind? What is a tailwind?
So headwinds and tailwinds are something that we use a fair bit at McKinsey just to draw out some of the nuance in basically, things that are you're riding a wave of positive momentum or growth or otherwise, versus the areas where the momentum is not necessarily at your back and you've got to, swim upstream or obviously kind of deal with the headwinds at the end of the day. And one of the things that we debated significantly with when we did, kind of the senior leader interviews in government and otherwise, and as we had the internal sausage making with our advisory board is, hey, is this a good news story or bad news story on indicators across the board? And one of the interesting things is across the board, it's a little bit of the eye of the beholder. Even the grades themselves, A, B, C, D, depending on what grades you got in school or what system you're calibrated toward or whatever, in the inflationary environment that we're in general, an A may be a good grade, or, it may just kind of be you're keeping up with the rest of the class in some way. And so what we tried to do is say, look, for each of these indicators, they're a headline set of really, really positive things across the board that we want to highlight. But there are some areas that are really problematic in others and are things that get us worried at the end of the day. I think I think Rachel and I, we've talked about this. This report card has basically made us the people who, kind of worry about everything in general. And even if something is an A or a B, we're like, okay, that headwind is still there. And so that grade may tick down next year if it's something that we're not sort of focused on appropriately. And so what we tried to do there is give a little bit of the internal, what gets us really excited and what makes us worried at the end of the day, and actually make that a little bit more prominent as we thought about each of the indicators.
Are headwinds and tailwinds completely external factors, or is some of them in the control of the student here, Department of Defense?
No, many of them, I think, are in control of the student. Maybe we talk about customer clarity in that one in some way, right? Which is, if I think about, we talk about three elements of, customer clarity across the board. And, Rachel should give you a few of the specifics here. But, customer clarity was the worst grade last year. I think was the worst grade this year as well. And it's something where, I think there's been some declines or at least sort of flat line across the board. Customer clarity one is top down, communication of a clear set of priorities for investment and otherwise. That's a piece that we look at. And there certainly are plenty of things that are in the student's control from that perspective. There's a set of things around, from a budgetary perspective, we're actually funding this on the governmental side from an aggregate level, but also in a predictable and sort of on-time manner. That's also something that potentially is in the students' control as well. But it was a very low grade, the lowest of the report card overall. And then, basically, are we thinking about sort of the acquisition pathways that actually are able to control that as well? So look, some of these, there's broad externalities in some way, but there's plenty that the student can deal with at the same time.
Yeah, so customer clarity is got some highlights and headlines and discussion in town when you guys put it out there. It got an F-. Fascinating. So one, Rachel, what is customer clarity? What are the elements of it, and what went into that grade?
So at the broadest level, we're thinking of customer clarity as the demand signal, the clarity of that demand signal or lack thereof, that the U.S. government as customer is sending to partners or potential partners in the private sector. There are a couple of different elements to that. Dale mentioned when he was talking about methodology, kind of those assessment criteria and assessment questions under each of our indicators. For customer clarity, there are the three that he just previewed. And that important one on the funding side, Arun, is where we do see the lowest grade in the report card. Not just an F, it was an F last year. This year it's an F- on the appropriations side. We were putting the finishing touches on our report card in March of 2024, which is when we published just a few months ago. And of course, we were halfway through FY24 and had not yet seen FY24 appropriations bills. And so as we kind of reckoned with how to assess that in terms of this, both quantitative and qualitative analysis that we're doing with the report card, we really wanted to send the signal and really raise that red flag to say, it's not just sending the right messages or leadership, being on the right talking points, whether that's at DOD, at Commerce, in Congress. That's all great. It's important. We assess that and give credit where credit's due in the report card along those lines. But under this customer clarity piece, there's this really important element of having the funding and acquisition pathways to match those aspirations. And that's where that lowest grade comes in. We did bring it down to an F- this year, given that we were, as I said, halfway through the appropriations year, or the fiscal year without an appropriations bill and operating CR to CR. So the way in which that has a detrimental effect across not just the defense enterprise overall, but the broader national security innovation enterprise is something that we really wanted to make clear with that grade.
Yeah, the delay in appropriations, it's going to affect both people trying to feed the system with their innovative ideas or manufactured products or deliver their services. But worse, it affects the people we're all trying to support, the operational side of things. The other thing we've talked about in some of the TI reports and some of the work that NDIA did in its vital signs report was to think about the equivalent of customer clarity, which is kind of market signaling, right? Clarity of the market. And I'm curious what you think about two different timeframes there. There's a discussion about the near-term market, where tell us how many munitions you want to buy in the next 2 years, and I know how many to make, and gets into a discussion of multi-year contracts and those sorts of things and other mechanisms by which a producer knows what the customer wants to buy. And then there's a slightly more complicated one, which is I want AI, I want directed energy. When it's ready, I'll buy it this many years from now. I'm signaling that to you so you can make the appropriate investments in workforce and infrastructure and innovation. And Dale, this gets to the point of a VC. What do they hear when they hear that, as opposed to a private equity firm, as opposed to a bank, as opposed to self-funded tiny small business? So in terms of this market signaling piece of customer clarity, what are your thoughts on how DoD is doing both in the short term and the long term?
Look, it's a challenge. Everybody knows it's a challenge, and we've spent a bunch of time, with some of the relevant actors in the DoD who I think are very, very thoughtfully working through this, very much to their credit. There's certain things that obviously everybody in aggregate in the system is a little bit hamstrung by at the end of the day. But when we talked about private capital a little bit previously, the argument was you kind of need all of these different sources of capital working in concert and investing in some of these areas across the board with enough sort of predictability along the way in order for people to, basically kind of close the business case, right? And so if I think about some of the things, for example, that the Office of Strategic Capital is trying to do to, in effect, kind of, reduce the cost of capital in some of these areas to unlock things that folks otherwise wouldn't be investing in, I think that that's great forward progress. And, there are organizations like that that are actually very clear about the investment framework, the things that they are prioritizing and sort of, laying a glove on. But if we think about the aggregate about, where dollars are getting deployed and, concern about, hey, is this program going to continue? How do I think about, in this area, what's the right PEO that I should be, interfacing with in order to basically have, sort of this thing? Do I go through DIU? Do I go through AFWorks and all of that? There's just, on the part of many of these firms, but also on the part of an investment allocator who's stepping 2 or 3 levels back on that and is just getting up to speed on what the hell this whole defense, acquisition thing looks like. It's very opaque in a lot of ways. And, I think there's a lot of work going on right now to educate folks here sort of across the board on this, but we clearly have a bunch of, a bunch of additional things to do. But again, the source of optimism here is that I think that people really on the private sector investor side really, really want to figure out a way to, allocate in this area. It's just they are on the same learning curve that others are unable to do this. So you've got the incentive alignment piece, you've got the multi-year buy piece and all of that. Obviously, we were doing this right around this version was published right around the time that the PPBE Commission recommendations came out, and there probably are candidly some things in there that would be fairly complementary to a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in terms of higher grades on the customer clarity side as well. But it's a journey, obviously.
As a commissioner, I appreciate you saying that about the report.
I know.
But, it's surprising. Okay, so that's the positive signs after you receive an F-. That was a very good spin on the F- there. So another area where there was a drop, which is very important, is talent base, right? Where you went from D+ to, which isn't great, to D. And that's a big concern. Workforce feeds government, feeds industry, feeds universities everywhere. What do you do about that? How do you stem the bleeding in that space?
Maybe I'll start with a word there, and then Dale should weigh in on this too. We've thought a lot about the talent-based piece, the broader workforce issues in exactly those ways that you say, Arun. This isn't just about, recruiting the best talent to go into government jobs in this space, although that's very important. It's also about recruiting the best and brightest to go to work for private sector companies that are, or academic institutions that are doing national security, mission-oriented, mission-aligned work. And the way that we look at it in the report card, and you see some of this reflected in our policy recommendations as well, which we haven't touched on, but just a word on those now. We advance a short set of just 5 or 6 key policy recommendations at the end of the report card that are really aimed at increasing those lower scoring grades. So both in our assessment of the talent and workforce issues, with that grade of D, which is downward trending, like you said, and also in our policy recommendations on that indicator in particular, we look at 2 sides of the coin. Number one, the American-born talent piece, and then number two, the second side of that coin, the foreign-born talent pipeline. So how do we think about graduating enough American-born STEM talent, and then recruiting those individuals into jobs across this ecosystem, both public and private? And then to the foreign-born talent piece, America has historically leaned into the strategic advantage of benefiting from the brain drain of countries around the world. That certainly was true during World War II and the Cold War in its aftermath. And how we think about that in the context of the strategic competition with China that we face now is at risk, given the way that our immigration system overall and the way that immigration solutions have really become polarized in this environment, and the progress seems insurmountable at times. But we wanted to put down at least that assessment and then some associated policy recommendations to say, look, if we're going to get after this talent piece in a holistic sense, what might that look like?
Yeah, I'd love to get to some of the recommendations. I want to stop off at one more grading area before we get there. Allies and partners. It's a big deal for the department. It's a big deal for NDIA, a lot of international partners within NDIA. Our Emerging Technologies Conference, heavy emphasis this year on allies and partners, a lot of speakers coming from other countries, UCOM and AFRICOM participating strongly in the whole event. What did you all have to say about how we're doing in engaging and working with our allies and partners?
So allies and partners, we totally agree, is an incredibly important indicator here. And like other things, we're looking at this room with a couple different lenses. Lens one, our kind of first criteria, is the level of linkage between U.S. and allies and partners in priority technology areas. And then the second is that's sort of the forward-looking positive piece of how do we accelerate. And then the other side is the protection side. So the U.S. balances protection of national security and IP while fostering innovation. So, this gets a little bit to the, high walls, small gardens. How are we doing on some of those elements and things like that, right? And this is a C across the board. I think we would argue we're probably a little bit more bullish on the sort of the forward linkages and some of the work that's been doing there versus sort of the protection mission. And that is just an incredibly challenging place across the board to think about all the things that we're trying to do around, intelligence sharing and kind of working from an innovation perspective and all that, while making sure that, kind of the secrets we develop remain in the places that they're going to. But again, we do see bright spots on the collaboration side. And so if in iteration number one, there had been some initial work on like NATO Diana and AUKUS and other areas that had been announced, and it was a little bit of wait and see at that point. And part of the reason why the grade moved up is because we are starting to see real deepening of collaboration in some of these key new alliance and partnership networks that are kind of fostering innovation in some of these areas. So again, tons of work remaining to do along these lines, but we see a lot of forward progress. And one of the things that Rachel and I have been doing quite a bit is we are increasingly seeing a broader alliance and partnership readership of the report card too, where folks are coming to us and saying, hey, you guys actually have a pretty good handle on what's happening in the US. We, to some extent, are trying to build a little bit of an scratch here in Europe, in Japan, in Australia, and other places. How can we, learn some of the lessons that took 15 to 20 years in the US on the acquisition side and in the funding ecosystem, and, opening up sort of animal spirits from an innovation entrepreneurship perspective to get to that in a much shorter period of time. And I think there's been a lot of learnings that people are gleaning from the report card amongst our friends overseas as well.
That's great, and apparently that's intellectual property that you're willing to share with friends overseas. One of the things we're thinking about also is the idea of NATO expansion, especially as we're talking a lot to UCOM. The countries that have entered NATO come with their own innovation and manufacturing bases, as well as their own workforces. as well as, to Rachel's point, maybe even the opportunity to host workforces, which is easier than in this country sometimes. And so, as you think about integrating all those allies and partners, some of those new NATO countries are pretty good at some things that we care about.
That's exactly right. So
we're running out of time. I want to go to a little bit of a speed round here. Tell us your favorite couple of recommendations and how so far they've been received by players in Pentagon, White House, Congress, industry.
Maybe I'll highlight one in particular, Arun, which is a recommendation that we made around access to classified infrastructure. So in the previous episode of the podcast, Dale talked about innovation capital as a real strength of this ecosystem. That's absolutely true on the financial capital side. Where we assess under that indicator, a little bit of a lower scoring grade was around the non-financial capital side. And we looked at some research that was done, in particular, a study by Texas National Security Review that looked at barriers to entry for startups in particular, and even academic research organizations in this space. And access to classified infrastructure was top on that list. And so we have a recommendation in the report card around commercial shared classified infrastructure space, kind of a WeWork, if you will.
Facilities and networks and processing, all of it, right?
That's right. And to minimize the burden on startup companies, on academic institutions to build their own infrastructure in that way if they want to get into this space. And frankly, probably to put even more of an emphasis on the security side by having companies that focus on just the security side do that work. And then, same protocols in terms of security and clearances and access as usual. So I highlight that one in particular, just to say that it was included in both the House and the Senate NDAA this bill cycle. And so that's something that we'll be watching to see if it makes its way in a pilot program form into law with this FY25 NDAA, and something that we're watching closely on our side.
That's my favorite one as well. So I'll foot stomp it, frankly. But just to say, that one is also a significant blocker on the customer clarity side as well. I mean, we've all heard the stories of, hey, I was going to go and, kind of bid on, X, Y, and Z, potential, RFI, RFP, and nobody told me about the classified annex on here, and I had no way to read it. I didn't understand what was happening. Based on what I saw in the unclassed version, I didn't think it made sense to bid, but somebody's like, no, you really should take a look at this. And for many of these folks that we're talking about, there's just no ability to see that today, right? And so some of these fundamental kind of scaling infrastructure challenges, and it's not, I think this is the first past the post here, but if you think about, classified scale compute infrastructure, even things like wind tunnels on the hypersonic side, and all of these, significant barrier particularly for new entrants to be involved in this ecosystem. So we're really excited about, I think, a lot of the forward progress that's happening there.
Yeah, and I commend the recommendations to everyone. They're very, very concise. They're very actionable. Hopefully they're being well received, both the executive branch and legislative branch. If you had to grade, I want to ask this in two different types of other students. If you had to grade our competitors, what do you think their report card would look like?
Well, tough in a lightning round, of course, but a few initial reflections on that. We get asked a lot with our report card, is this a grade against our competitors? And there's an element across a couple of our indicators where we do take that into account, the investments and progress, especially on something like defense modernization that we talked about in the last episode, that where we do see our competitors making progress at speed and scale, multitudes ahead of where we are. I might dodge the grading our competitors question a bit, and if I may just talk about another project we do at the Reagan Institute, which is a public opinion poll. We ask the American people a number of questions. A set of our questions is focused on how they think the U.S. military is doing versus the Chinese military across a bunch of different capabilities. We think about the Cold War. We think about President Reagan's legacy and his investments in our military. And we know that in the context of his leadership, he was not okay with inferiority. He was not okay with parity. He knew that we needed American military superiority vis-a-vis our competitors. And what I can tell you, Arun, is that the American people are actually quite bullish on American military strength. We have been told that we have the strongest and best military in the world, and of course we do. But where we see sort of a little bit of a misalignment maybe is, sort of the overall national security expert consensus around the erosion of the U.S. military edge. And I do think that's a lot of what went into the original impetus for the report card, is the assessment that we're falling behind. And as we've talked about across a couple different issues, that's something that we really want to shine a light on and provide the basis for progress to regain that military advantage, regain that superiority.
That's great. The last question then, so building on that and the progress you've made, looking to the future then, what's next for this project? What's next for the report card? And how can NDIA members get involved if they feel like they'd like to get involved?
Well, we are, as Dale mentioned, constantly iterating toward our next version of the report card. So we'll publish our report card in March of each year. So the 2025 report card is in its early research stages now. To your point about NDIA members, we are always looking for input and feedback on the report card. I mentioned that we conduct on the research team a number of subject matter expert interviews every year, and would love to hear from NDIA members feedback on the report card. What are we missing in our analysis? Where can we better capture what's happening, either challenges or signs of progress and opportunity that are happening across the ecosystem? Certainly the Reagan National Defense Forum, which we host in December of each year at the Reagan Library, is a great place for those conversations to happen, and we capture those in our report card analysis. But we'd always love to hear from individual NDIA members and arrange a time to get feedback and input as we work toward that 2025 NSIB report card.
Yeah, we'll certainly drop links to the report, to the Reagan Institute, so people can reach out and get in touch. And we hope to have you actively participating in some NDIA activities in future briefing pieces of the report, maybe going forward. So with that, I want to thank you both, Rachel and Dale, for joining us for this great conversation today.
Thanks, Arun.
Thanks.
And so for everybody, I want to close by telling you to visit NDIA's and ETI's website to sign up, and Reagan Institute's website to sign up for all of our great events and working groups. Sign up for our mailing list and register for our upcoming conferences and other educational offerings, including our Tech 101 series. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Stay up to date with all of our latest content. A special thank you to Melanie Yu and Daniel Park for producing the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us for Emerging Tech Horizons.